That kind of lively music. We should have this actually coming out of the news at 6. A much better way to wake people up mornings around the Magic Valley. We're 6 minutes after 9 o'clock, and we're at 18 on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning. Well, it's been a long time since we had an opportunity to speak with Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil, and he joins us periodically on the show. And of course, you've got to remember he's got such a wide latitude of things he can discuss because, again, he was the administrator of the Shuttle Challenger Commission, served 20 years in the Air Force, worked, of course, for both President Reagan and, at the time, Vice President George H.W. Bush. Worked again with the Air Force Thunderbirds, and so he's got an extensive resume. I think I've mentioned it before when there was a big anniversary celebration at Fort McHenry to commemorate the battle that took place there, where the Star Spangled Banner ended up being written. He was there, and he was working on that project with the late Tom Clancy. So he has, as I say, probably the longest resume in the Western world. Is that about right, Colonel? Am I on the spot on that one?
Well, I think there may be a slight exaggeration there, but not by much. Well, I attribute it to maybe not so much a resume as I just never could keep a job.
Well, hey, I've got a reason you're here today is because I happened to see something yesterday, and I sent you a link to this from a website called Mysterious Universe. And the reason I thought about you right away, about half a dozen years ago, when we were both at the time residents of the eastern shore of the Chesapeake, there had been a really loud boom that had taken place out on the Atlantic Ocean, and it rattled windows in 3 states. I mean, it came up the shoreline from Virginia, Maryland, and into southern Delaware. Because I remember your wife mentioning that her kitchen windows were shaking when this happened. It took about 2 months before finally a spokesman for the Navy at Pax River said, "Well, it was a sonic boom." And I think you told me at the time a sonic boom wouldn't necessarily rattle 8 to 10 counties. It might be a lot more localized in that situation. But we've got a story that's been popping up around the country left and right, and we've had them here in Idaho. We have people saying they're hearing these loud booms in the north. In the north, it's dismissed as being these ice fractures that are going on, and but yet they're having them in the deep south and all around the country. And my question is, you've got a little bit of experience dealing with sonic booms and the like. What do you suppose is going on here?
Well, certainly they are really a phenomena, if you want to call it that exists and has been proven as one of the culprits, if you will. But there, these explosions and noises and shaking of the earth and that sort of thing are not a new phenomenon. They've been reported back starting in about the 17th century, and the different parts of the world. And now they've really sort of broken the potential causes into there are 5 different potentials. One are super bolts and upper atmosphere storms, and they've been discovered more recently because of satellite. And then there are frost quakes, and that's cracking of the earth caused by super instantaneous almost weather drops that freeze the earth, and then you get a warming, and it causes these frost quakes. Supersonic aircraft, of course. And then there are a lot of sounds in nature that can resemble that. They've talked about large schools of fish under ships, and these were back in the days in the sailing ships. They would reported hearing these crazy sounds, and they've been attributed in some cases to large schools of fish swimming under the ship. Um, climate change is another, and then there's this, the last but not least, the exploding head syndrome. But that's a more recent phenomenon. That's been caused by all the liberals in the country.
Well,
uh,
there's a few that make my head want to explode too.
yeah, I can't afford enough duct tape anymore to. I
Well,
just have to walk around with a vice on my head.
well, what people may be hearing then is what you're saying is not necessarily one phenomenon, but what
Yeah.
they're hearing is a series of things, anywhere from the typical sonic boom, but to an ice fracture somewhere, and other places, it's related to storms. So what we're getting is a combination here, and it's all getting lumped together.
Yeah, because in most cases, people describe these phenomena in different sounds, and no one has that I know of, or I haven't heard, has ever really recorded that many the sounds when they occur. Um, I know there have been on internet. There are some that have been where you hear this almost, they call it Gabriel's horn or something like that.
Yeah.
It sounds like a trumpet call. Those have been more in our country reported, as I recall, but none recently. Um, but I think it's really a combination of those five different areas, that because there's so much about the Earth that we still don't understand, and so I don't think it's anything. I don't think it's aliens. What alien in their right mind would want to come to this world nowadays?
One of them we were
They
just
got to
talking
be
about is
smart for
serving
that.
in the House of Representatives, but the
Yeah.
she escaped from Area 51. Uh,
Yeah, well, Acacia, our congresswoman from New York, I'm convinced that she is a CIA experiment gone wrong, and she escaped, and now they can't take her back because she's out there.
Well, you reference some of those sounds that people hear, and it's like horns or something, or music, some sort of music coming from the sky. About 15 years ago, it was a really chilly day. I remember taking my daughter out to go. We went out sledding. She loved to go sledding, and there was a school near the house with a beautiful hill. But we were about the only people there. It was late afternoon, just before sunset, and she was going down the hill. I was standing at the top of the hill watching, and I was just listening to these sounds overhead. And you could almost hear this, like, just this steady, almost, it was a little, but a steady light rumble in the air. And
Mm-hmm.
I wrote some friends and mentioned that one of them happened to be from Finland, and he wrote me back and he said, I get the same thing here. But that's likely just on a quiet, wintry day, probably just you're hearing something even maybe out of the jet stream.
Yeah, that's entirely possible, and I think more and more the idea of what's called the super bolts in the upper atmosphere, and they occur. It could be a bright sunny day, but they're so high up, and if it's daytime, particular, uh, it's like a super lightning flash, but you can't see it on the ground, and so that may be a large that and the sonic booms from aircraft, and then there are a lot of underwater experimentation going on. The militaries, not only in our country, that have been reported, investigated, and nothing was found, but that doesn't mean that that's not what happened.
Well, I mentioned that spokesman at Pax River a number of years ago who made that comment about that big offshore boom in the mid Atlantic. And at the time, I think that it took them, a couple of months to get a cover story together. It may have been some, call it activity going on out there that they can't really reveal because you don't want hostiles to know about it. And I think sometimes we may be dealing with a little bit of that. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I would certainly agree with that. Um, and it's it's just a combination of different, because it's been reported in almost every part of the globe, and going back into the 17th century, before we had supersonic aircraft, uh, and they've been added to the mix, I guess, so far. But I don't just I had and I still can't say anything that much about. I had a friend of mine in the Air Force who worked was on the Project Blue Book, uh, back when the Air Force was investigating uh, alien potentials for aliens, and uh, even back then, this was in the 70s. Uh, they there was I could say that there is some evidence back then that there are such things as, if you want to call them, flying saucers.
Well,
And
we had
if that's
something
the
go through the
case, they
solar
could,
system just a year ago, right? That people say may have been a probe of some kind.
yeah, yeah, and they could, if that's the case, they could be a contributor also to the sonic booms. They travel so fast, my God, they could make a lot of racket with the sonic booms. I don't, like I say, I don't think you can attribute it all to one particular great mystery.
If you can stick around with us for through the next segment, I've got to get to a break in just a minute, but I got a little follow up on this. But also, you made reference to the Congresswoman from New York, and I do want to get your take on that as long as we've got you on the line. And I've been reading all of your posts about it over the course of the last couple of weeks, and so I just think it think that you have an insight, having worked on Capitol Hill, that you might be able to share with us after the break, if you could stick around and do that.
Sure.
I want to mention very quickly, Lieutenant Colonel Steve Heil joining us on the phone this morning. Uh, One of my old bosses said, and Steve, you'll remember this guy. He said, you don't have to mention people who are on the telephone." As if I think we lost Steve anyway. But he said, one of my old bosses said that, and of course Steve knew him too as well. And you can tell though, right? He's not in the studio, and so when I mention that, I don't know uh, what the big deal happens to be about that. But I worked with an old boss who actually had been with Strategic Air Command, and he was acquainted with Steve as well. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, it's 18. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And, I'm going to say 40 minutes left in Magic Valley this morning.